So with that, I would like to invite, right, the next study. The folks from the Health Sciences Policy Board are having their ears pricked up. Okay. I want to invite Pat King to the podium, who is going to talk to us about embryo and embryonic stem cell research. While she gets herself ready, I will introduce her. Professor King is a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. She also has an adjunct appointment at Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health. Her work spans a range of important bioethics and public policy areas, including service on the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research, as well as the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. So, Pat, we're very pleased to have you here, and thank you for making the time.
Thanks so much, Jeff. From listening today, I think my role is to be the voice of doom, because you're not optimistic when you look at the history that I'm been asked to describe. So I've been asked to talk about the history of embryo research and stem cell research in the United States. So I'd start by saying that when baby Louise was born in 1978, the National Commission was still in existence. We'd done our duty, and we asked that this issue be passed to a successor board, which was created, the Ethics Advisory Board, which actually came into existence to take a look at research on embryos in the context of reproductive technologies. They issued a report, and the federal government promptly ignored them and waited for their commission to expire, which it did. So it meant that after 1980, there was a complete absence of any structure that might consider research involving embryos in the United States. In 1993, and notice that's quite a few years, decades, where no work was funded by government and there was no oversight. In 1993, the NIH Revitalization Act nullified the regulation that created the Ethics Advisory Board, which had dealt with IVF research. After that was passed, NIH started receiving proposals for research that involved embryos. But before going ahead, they decided to create a panel which would take a look at the question of embryo research. And that panel was created in 1993. I was asked to be the co-chair for policy, and Alta was also a member of this board. The mandate was to determine what was acceptable versus unacceptable versus warranted additional review for federal funding. So we were to categorize research proposals in those three categories: accept, reject, or put off for a future time. This panel concluded that sufficient arguments existed to support the permissibility of certain areas of research involving the pre-implantation embryo, human embryo, within a framework of stringent guidelines. In reaching the basic decision that we could do some research on the human embryo, we had to consider a number of ethical and legal issues. The primary ethical issue, as you might imagine, was the status of the embryo. And the committee had to spend considerable time trying to determine at one point in early human development was the relevant point for research. And we picked a point after 14 days, essentially. We also had to discuss gametes and the question of informed consent and sources of gametes in order to form embryos. We were able to reach conclusions on those questions for the work of the Human Embryo Research Panel. In addition, we tried to assess what benefits might flow from doing research on pre-implantation human embryos. And we determined that some of that work was acceptable. The issue that was most controversial in this panel was the question of whether it was permissible to create an embryo in order to do research on that embryo. And the panel ultimately, this was the most controversial provision actually, ultimately agreed that yes, it was permissible to create an embryo for purposes of doing research. In the back of everybody's mind, of course, during the life of the Embryo Research Panel was the prospect of being able to do stem cell research down the line, though at the time that we met, that was stem cell lines had not been created. In the interest of full disclosure, I'd like to say that I dissented from the report I co-chaired with respect to the question of creation of embryos. I wanted to see the creation of embryos for purposes of research placed in the category that said for future discussion. I did so because I had some policy concerns about what we were doing. But it became a source of some public contention. After the report was finalized and voted on, the report went to the director of NIH Advisory Committee, which also voted and accepted the report. And 3 hours later, President Clinton disavowed it. It was most stunning. We expected pushback, but 3 hours later was incredible turnaround time for government. After President Clinton reached his decision, subsequently Congress passed what is now called the Dickey Wicker Amendment. It was a rider attached to the NIH appropriation bill and restricted the use of federal funds for creating, destroying, or knowingly injuring human embryos, and banned the use of federal money to create embryos for research. The amendment has been reenacted every year since then as a rider on the appropriations bill. In 1998, John Gearhart and James Thompson, separately but very close together in time, published articles establishing that they had isolated and cultivated human embryonic stem cells. This was a momentous achievement. And it occurred during the during the time of the National Bioethics Advisory Committee that had been created by President Clinton. The first, and there are others, I was not on that committee, but the first consideration in the committee led to a group of preliminary considerations that would allow stem cell research to go forward. President Clinton again intervened and found the preliminary considerations not acceptable. Ultimately, as I understand it, the NBAC issued a report calling for funding of embryo research in the sense of being able to do stem cell research, on the basis of a legal memo that had been submitted by Harriet Rabb, who was then general counsel of HHS, in which she argued successfully that doing stem cell research did not fall under the Dickey Wicker amendment, and that meant if stem cells were created without government funding, researchers could do research on those stem cells with government funding. As I'm sure most of you know, that was in 2000, and as I'm sure that most of you know, among the first things that President Bush did when he came into office in 2001 was to order a review of those guidelines and ultimately promulgated an executive order that said that work could only go on the stem cells that had been created prior to August 9, 2001, and officially withdrew the Clinton guidelines. When President Obama was elected 4 years later, when stem cell research was at the top of the agenda, he promptly reversed President Bush and reinstated the guidelines that had been promulgated by President Clinton. But that didn't end the matter. Shortly thereafter, plaintiffs, and I must say one was a student of my bioethics seminar, I was stunned, plaintiffs filed a lawsuit, Shirley versus Sebelius, arguing that the Dickey Wicker Amendment applied to stem cell research. The district court judge agreed with the petitioners and enjoined stem cell research for 17 days until the Court of Appeals could remove the injunction and then consider the case on its merits. They determined that the research could go forward, that it was not covered by the Dickey Wicker Amendment, and finally in August 2012, the Supreme Court of the United States denied cert to the petitioner's suit, so we have been able to go forward with stem cell research after that point. So I was also asked not only to give you facts that a lot of you, I think, are familiar with, but to bring any lessons that I might have from the work of the Embryo Research Panel and this history of working with human embryos in research. My first lesson is that when you do run a panel and you discuss ethical issues, you must keep your eyes on the context. Our context hasn't changed very much with respect to human embryos. And stem cell research will certainly turn on who our next president is if you have a lot of doubt about that. So my first point would be that any discussion that involves research on human embryos plays into a very complex set of issues that are related but not directly at issue. And of course, the biggest one is abortion. And because of the belief that human life begins at conception. So the first thing I draw from that is if there are multiple techniques that can be used for MRT, then all things being equal, the best way to go is with one that doesn't involve destroying the embryo, because it invites attention, and you don't know what's going to happen once attention is being paid to it. That would be the best way that I would put that. The second point that I would make is I've noticed in all the materials about MRT, everybody likes to refer to the zygote. Good luck. I understand scientific technology, and I understand how we think about embryonic development. but that's limited to a few people. If this becomes news, this is embryo, not zygote. And you can talk 1 day cell versus half a day cell versus 2 day cell. And for a lot of people who care about these issues, it's an embryo. I think we should use scientifically correct terms, but must be aware of a broader environment. And I would come at this a little bit differently. If I were on this panel, having gone through what I went through before, I would have to ask myself what other areas of science I endangered potentially. I would ask that because I'm a policy person, and I'd want to think about that in a broader way. It will not be easy to disconnect MRT from other developments that are taking place simultaneously. It won't be, and the one I have in mind is germ cell techniques.
Yeah.
I do understand the difference that is being offered and emphasized between MRT and what we're all afraid of, germline technologies. And I appreciate the attempt to draw the distinction. But I wouldn't get carried away with the distinction, because some people are not going to look at it in the way that we might look at it. Some people will ask, will this characteristic be inherited by the child and the child's child? And the answer will be, of course, yes. And that will be germline modification. Although we should be very careful to try to make sure that if people read correctly, that we've tried to draw those distinctions. So I say that because we can't control everything. I learned we can't control everything we think we're controlling. When we analyze ethical issues, we parse statements in order to isolate and clearly define. But when we do so, keep the broader context in mind. And my last lesson, and this went to stem cell research, my last lesson is it is sometimes better to develop policy, research policy, incrementally. I've always believed it would have been better to have started the stem cell discussion after we had stem cell lines. Because when we're in the range of what is potential, even though scientists can see it coming down the pike, that wasn't a problem. Scientists may be the only ones seeing it come down the pike, and you set up opposition before you even get there. I'm going to close.
Thanks.
Your red light has been...
Yeah.
Sorry.
But thank you for you have a wealth of experience and knowledge, and we appreciate your sharing it with us. So